Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we discuss the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion, and joining me on the panel is Chief Ken Kenna. This week, we're excited to bring back a friend of the show, Dr. Andrew Holter. For our new listeners, he is an industrial and organizational psychologist with a background in the fire service. Andrew, it's great to have you back. And before we dive into our discussion of camaraderie in the fire service, can you share with us what you've been up to? What's new?
Sure. I haven't completely disappeared, although people have been asking like where I've been. My family just went through a fairly big move and relocation. We're now in the Washington, D.C. area. In addition to that, we've added another member to our family. My wife and I had a child here just a few months ago. I've been kind of taking a back seat and focusing on that for a little while. So that's kind of been my priority for the past few months.
Yeah, well, congratulations. That is outstanding news. We're so happy for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for making the time to sit down and talk with us, especially during the busy holiday season and now with a new little one to take up a lot of your time. So we really appreciate that. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're focusing on camaraderie in the fire service today. So, I want to ask you, Andrew, in your experience, what role does camaraderie play in shaping the performance and morale of a fire crew?
Yeah, I think we know that teams outperform individual efforts, right? And that's why we sort of organize ourselves, whether it's the fire service or any other type of organization, into teams. And coming up through the fire service and seeing that camaraderie, it was always very interesting to me, that dynamic and how unique it is for the fire service. And it is different in a way from many other professions. And now from the more academic and organizational psychologist side, it's really interesting to see how, from a research perspective, all of these pieces should work together to actually enhance team performance when all the right pieces are there. And I think that the fire service has gotten lucky for a long time of being able to use that, but they haven't necessarily been doing it on purpose. And there's certainly ways to get better at a lot of aspects related to that to kind of increase that performance. And something also really important for us, safety.
I'm curious if I could ask, having grown up in the fire service, and I literally mean grown up in the fire service, and I mean I started when I was in high school. I was 16 years old when I got interested in the fire service, and I never looked back. So for me, it was just sort of baked into who I was. So I'm really curious about the comment that you just made about how it's just kind of happened accidentally, and we've been sort of lucky. How has that happened accidentally?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it is the sort of the nature of the job and what it entails, that reliance on each other sort of creates this intrinsic need for people to have that camaraderie, to have that trust that's not necessarily earned, but just given. That when we show up, maybe I'm on a different shift, or, probably chief in our cases where we both started out perhaps volunteering. Um, you know, you just kind of accept the folks around you, they accept you, and you're like, if something bad ever happens, I assume these people will have my back. And I think that that's kind of helped keep that camaraderie aspect in the fire service and just has made it part of what it is. But I think that there's definitely challenges and things that we see today that make that camaraderie maybe not necessarily come as easy for everybody all the time.
Can you expand on what some of those challenges you're seeing today are?
For sure. I mean, I think we're at a time where a lot of folks aren't coming up in the fire service. And so people are entering it from all kinds of avenues and different perspectives. And part of that, it might be a challenge for them to feel like they belong with that organization. There's definitely a lot on people's plates today. And I think as a society, it's really important for us to focus on things like belonging and inclusion. And those parts of our camaraderie haven't been at the forefront of the fire service. And so when we look to, widening the door and welcoming in people who necessarily didn't start out here, how are we making a conscious effort now to include those people to make them feel like they belong when perhaps in the past it just sort of came with the territory. And now it's actually something that we have to work on.
And from a leadership perspective, I think it's so important. What brought you here again, and I can almost guarantee you we'll bring you back again because I find this so fascinating. It for me, having just it was sort of baked into who I was. I accepted everything that was sort of in front of me. There was no conscious thought that, oh, I'm interested in that. It was like it found me. And so I've just sort of absorbed it organically over time. But that's not the norm anymore. We don't see the kinds of numbers that we used to see gravitating towards public safety in general, yet alone the fire service. And so I think our need to reach out and bring people in and let them know what we do and why they might want a career in the fire service is more important now more than ever. But your point about being inclusive to as more groups is really critical and really challenging and something I think that from a leadership perspective we absolutely have to focus on. But that can be a really big challenge. I mean, that's at least that's my experience. Am I correct?
Oh, for sure. I don't think that in some of the work that I've done with public safety agencies, we've actually deployed things, like different psychometric assessments, with, in other words, just surveys to measure things like belonging. And you'll find some really interesting data when you do that. And I haven't done it yet where leaders weren't surprised. I feel like oftentimes leaders assume a little bit more to the fact that yeah, people feel like they belong here. This is an inclusive environment. I don't hear any concerns about that. I think we have an issue over here. But then when we go to measure it, you find issues with things like belonging or psychological safety, and people don't necessarily feel like they have a voice or a seat at the table, and that they belong in that organization.
It's almost like a lack of self-awareness in some respects, yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that overconfidence in those kinds of things is pretty typical. We're just not necessarily looking past the surface level when it comes, especially this happens a lot with recruitment and retention. And you still see organizations out there throwing sign-on bonuses at that problem and those kinds of old, tried and not true methods of fixing it. And we have to maybe take a deeper approach to those things and sort of drill down to what those root causes are. Why are we having a problem with retention? Why is it that we're having folks suffer from moral injury in our profession? Where are these missing pieces? And I really think belonging, I think loneliness definitely is a modern day type of crisis in our society. And the fire service does have to take a really deliberate effort to make sure they're addressing it within their organizations.
I couldn't agree more. It's for me what the gratitude that I have for the work that I was able to do and blessed to be able to do for quite some time. The idea of signing bonuses and all these other things to try and it was like it's almost hard for me to get my head wrapped around it because it's like that's not the part of the job that ever brought me joy. That it's the why is always the thing that I think brought me the joy and the teamwork and all the other stuff about it. That to me that's the thing. That's the most important part.
Yeah, yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think that there are some cases, not to bring up like psychology things or like your fire officer one curriculum, and it's sort of been debated, but like, we think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We look at things like pay and benefits and are our folks being taken care of? Do they have what they need to meet their needs? And if so, what are the other aspects? And safety is a part of that, do they feel safe coming to work? Do they feel like the organization they're working for actually cares about them as an individual? And there's a lot of ways that individuals perceive that care. And I think that's something that we struggle with, especially where a lot of us are municipal government based. We're fighting budgetary constraints and things like that. And so there's always that sort of dilemma as to, how important am I, the firefighter, to, this city or this municipality, if we're constantly fighting these things, or if we boil it down more to the leadership level, if my leaders aren't taking a vested interest in my, professional development, or, what my goals and career aspirations are, things like that.
It really feels like we're tiptoeing around like a silent quitter, which is something that Chief Kenma and I have had discussions about, not on the podcast, but between him and I. So, Andrew, for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with the silent quitter term, can you explain that for us before we really dive into that topic?
Sure. I love when pop psychology becomes what the academics have to try to explain out. I feel like quiet quitting and silent quitter and all those things uh, are those buzz terms. But, really, this is something that's been around for a long time, and it's simply the disengaged employee. It's somebody who is not actively engaged in their organization or their work. They're not actively disengaged. They're not kind of trying to sabotage anything, but they're just going through the motions. And there's really a lot of causes that could put somebody in that kind of a situation. But as the organization, are you measuring engagement? Are you looking at these kinds of conditions within your organization? I think that's the first step, is really understanding where your organization's at. And then you can get a baseline, just like you would with response data. That's establish a baseline and then work towards a goal. And when you see where your gaps are in that, then you can start to address engagement at those root cause levels. Do people feel like they're not being recognized, that they're not, their individual contributions aren't valued or aren't tied to the overall success of the organization? Where is the break in that chain that's led that person to become disengaged?
Really a mixture of art and science as I'm thinking about what you're saying. The whole concept of recognition and doing it in a way that is meaningful to the individual receiving the recognition, and to those that believe that recognition is appropriate, to not have it come off as contrived or manufactured for the purposes of some sort of theory, a theater kind of a thing, is very delicate, right? Very delicate. Recognition is so incredibly important, but the what it means to the individual is that's so important. We've been through this in my own organization, and it's you ask people, hey, recognize your peers, make sure to let us know the things that they've done and all this other kind of stuff, and then you have your awards thing, and invariably there's the, well, how come we didn't recognize so and so, or why are they recognizing that person for that? And you're like, God, you almost can't get this right.
Yeah, and that's funny you say that, and I'm laughing because I think we've all seen that, We're like, I can't believe Engine 2 is getting a thing for that. That's ridiculous. Uh, so so I think you're right, and I think we have a lot of these structural things that we've built for ourselves, like performance management. We're going to do this once a year evaluation, and we're going to have this once a year award ceremony, and these kinds of things. And I think we have to look at those institutionalized programs and ask ourselves if they're serving, what purpose they're serving. Why are we doing it? Um, and if we're doing it for engagement or performance enhancement or whatever the case may be, is that the right avenue? We know for things like performance management, a once a year review is essentially useless. It's not going to drive performance. It's not going to help your organization, and people are going to complain about it. And, if it has anything to do with money, you're not going to get real results because people don't necessarily want to take away merit increases for their workers, especially in public safety. So there's all these interconnected issues that might be occurring there. Similarly, with an annual awards banquet. I my own awards banquet as I was a career firefighter. I remember them recognizing a few different responders on a call that I was on, and it was like 9 months after the fact. And I think at that point, like we had all come down off the high of what we had accomplished at that call. We had gotten the backstory on how the individual involved had recovered. They had stopped by the firehouse already. This was like old news. And then we're getting recognized for it in an awards banquet. And I think that, timeliness is important. And a lot of times, whether it's performance or reward recognition, sometimes the small candid feedback and that quick hitting, immediately following activities type of thing, that can be just as impactful as the big kind of grandiose displays that we've created for ourselves. But we put so much more effort into those like annual performance reviews and awards banquets, when maybe we need to look at, how are we recognizing and treating each other on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah, buying me a pony a year after you didn't show up for my dance recital is a whole different ballgame, right? You know, it's like it's kind of meaningless. Thanks for the pony, but not what I wanted. I really wanted to be at my dance recital.
Yeah, I've I've never heard that one, but definitely going to steal that. That's great. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's sort of the same if you're trying to correct behaviors as well and get people to perform better. We can't come to them with this annual performance review, you know, months, years later, whatever the case may be. And I think all of this is when we look back at camaraderie is, how do we elevate our team performance? And there's so many pieces to that puzzle. And there's also these factors as well. How, what are the breakdowns in team performance? Where are the areas that are causing grief? And it could be things like this, like your annual performance reviews, or if you have a lackluster performer on a team, is that person being held accountable and kind of brought up to the performance standard that's expected of them, or is it being ignored? And those are the things that will definitely break down team performance and that kind of camaraderie aspect.
I recall early in my career, in my early career as a paramedic, and then my early career as a firefighter, I would say there was more critique I mean, legitimate critique, whether it was a tape critique, running a medical call, or an after action from a fire where we would all get together and we would do a fire critique. It was much, I don't know, they're just, I don't think we do them the same way, at least in my organization. We didn't do them the same way when I retired. It was almost like we'd become way too sensitive to being critical about getting better and making sure that we were being efficient and all that other stuff. It's like we lost the ability to have that conversation without hurting each other, kind of a thing. And don't get me wrong. I remember being terrified of going to a tape critique and having my voice come up on the radio because I didn't want to be that person. But I also, when we're talking about life and death, we're sharing, responsibility for one another's life. It's like, I need to know, what you're doing, right? I'm just curious what you think about what seems to me like a loss of the ability to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And anecdotally, Google found that psychological safety was the best predictor of outcomes, performance outcomes for teams. And whether it's candid experience for myself and, my experiences in the fire service and in EMS, or it is, from an academic perspective or my work actually measuring psychological safety with public safety agencies, we just don't see it. We just don't see it. We don't see it in their leadership teams. We don't see it in their hierarchies from, captains and lieutenants to frontline staff. And I don't know necessarily, and there's not really a lot of research out there in our environment to give us a clue as to what all the causes are of that. Some of my initial thoughts would be that our paramilitary sort of indoctrination sort of builds that, a new firefighter should never question the captain, right? Like that's just speak when spoken to, that kind of thing. And has that led to us creating a culture where, we don't want to share, we don't want to talk, we're afraid of what might happen if we really get vulnerable and talk about our performance, or yeah, hey guys, I know that that call I kind of botched the size up and whatever, but yeah, I welcome your feedback. I don't think we have those types of conversations like we need to, and it does take it takes a leader's effort to really drive that kind of psychological safety creation in an organization. And just in my experiences, we just don't see it.
It's interesting because when we first started talking, I was thinking about how things are different, and what I think of has built the teams that I have been on. That what I felt like were really good teams, and the ability to feel like people could rely upon you, or that you could rely upon others. And there was that, no, we've got this, right? I've got you, you've got me. That it sort of bred this real comfort that I had on some of what I felt were good, strong teams. I, I I'm curious in organizations that are more prone to go to a lot of calls and really put it out there and really put it on the line, or really taking a lot of risk on a fairly regular basis versus your departments and crews that go to a couple of pickup and putbacks occasionally, and once they get a fire, maybe once every 2 years. I'm curious if you see a difference between the camaraderie and the dynamic between those teams that are tested, I guess is a way to say it, or if you understand what I'm saying there.
Yeah, I do for sure, and I don't know that I personally have worked with enough diversity in that to really notice anything like that. But the studies and work I have done with individual organizations, individual fire departments or EMS entities, when we get it's pretty interesting, but when you have a fundamental issue in that organization, it usually will appear itself to everybody. They just have a different perspective of it, and I always equate it to like watching a movie, or seeing an event play out. Everybody saw the same movie, but depending on where you sat in the theater, you may have heard things a little bit differently. You may have had a different angle. You may have picked up on something, in that film that somebody else didn't see. And so in an organization, everybody's got a different seat as they're kind of watching the everything play out. But generally, if there's a fundamental problem like psychological safety or accountability, something like that, everybody's going to have a way to convey it. It might just look and sound a little different when they tell you about it.
Many years ago in the organization that I worked for, we had suffered a line of duty uh, death. And the way you just described it is exactly how I would describe the days and months and years following that event. It was shocking to the organization for sure, like any of those things would be. But to have 350 perspectives about something that happened, and 350 perspectives about the organization that we all still continued to work for going forward, was it completely blew my mind to go through that. It was really quite eye-opening for me.
Yeah, and I think Chief, that just highlights that the uniqueness of that lived experience. Each person ha is going to interpret every event that happens in life a different way. And I think that when it comes to the fire service, we haven't necessarily talked about things like that, like an individualistic society or organization. When you're going through fire officer school or those things, we don't really talk about the leader-follower relationship. We don't talk about the different leadership theories that really focus on the individual and how you would lead them and how you have to kind of craft your approach for each person. Usually it's like, here's your standard operating procedures. We want you to act and run like this. but you can't necessarily run people like a blue card size up an incident approach. Leading individuals has to be done on a one-on-one, individual level if you're going to reach that optimal performance. Just for that reason, they all are going to have their own kind of perspective about everything in life.
Well, it's a really important point that I think a lot of folks might miss because it's not really pointed, we don't really focus on it, and I think we should from a leadership perspective. It's not 350, it's not a block. It's 350 individuals with perspectives and lived experiences and very, very unique. And it's a much more nuanced, very delicate, very important skill set or group of skill sets that have to be developed. And it can be very complicated. And and I will tell you as an individual, it's easy to fail having been in that position, and it hurts because you don't want to, but it can be really challenging.
For sure, for sure. And I think that that's something we all, no matter what level we're at in the organization, we all have to give ourselves that kind of space to acknowledge, and we have to give each other that grace. Like we're all human. We're all going to miss the mark. There, nobody's perfect, whether it's in, executing a fire hose deployment on a bread and butter fire, or it's leading an entire fire service organization. You're not going to get it right every time.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding.
All right, we're getting a little bit close to the end of our time here, but I want to give you a scenario, Dr. Holter, and get your opinion on it. And this comes from a conversation that Chief Kenma and I had a couple weeks ago. So the scenario is you have a new young firefighter who just passed the recruit academy, and they're getting placed with a crew now. And the crew that this young firefighter happens to get placed with is an older crew. They're nearing the end of their fire service career, but so they're not really at that point where they would bother switching departments, They are a group of complainers, we'll say. Like they're not happy with the chief, they're not happy with the captain, nothing, they're not happy about anything. Even something like a school pizza party, they're rolling their eyes at. Can you kind of give us some insights on, and of course, this is frustrating to the new firefighter, but they're trying to be the good new recruit who's saying yes and only talking to and spoken to, like you were saying earlier. Can you kind of explain how the negative impacts that can have not only to that young firefighter, but even possibly to the organization, and then how that might transfer to a fire scene?
Yeah, wow. I always tell people you have to be careful asking me questions like that because could quickly turn into a dissertation. I feel like this is a common phenomenon that a lot of fire departments are faced with, especially with the rates of turnover and things that they're seeing. They have high volumes of placement, and perhaps in the past they were able to, kind of nitpick where their new firefighters went to avoid these, the island of misfit toys, right? Everybody has that station or that company where you're like, yeah, we're going to send you over there since you're like not participating in things. And and then you come to this point where you're assigning somebody new. Um, there's a lot of thoughts I have on this. Obviously, first of all, why are we, and I know sometimes it's much easier said than done. Why are we tolerating this? And what are we doing to increase the performance of this team and address their concerns? On the new firefighter side, the scary thing is, the unfolding model of turnover. And the way I look at this is through that lens is all somebody needs is kind of one shock event that begins a decision pathway that lends itself to them deciding to leave an organization. So that new firefighter comes on, they're probably super excited. They want to get out of recruit school. They want to go to work. And then we put them with folks that pretty much seem to hate everything that occurs on a daily basis. That could very easily be a shock event that starts to create a decision pathway in this individual's mind that, you know what, maybe this wasn't for me. maybe this is for me, but not here at this fire department. I have to go find a better one, or things that are harmful to the organization. And ultimately, if we don't address the root cause of that situation, we're going to kind of keep having that predicament occur. If we're assigning new firefighters to this and kind of letting them get chewed up and spit out. Um, and the old adage of like, well, then they weren't gritty enough or they weren't resilient enough. We have come to find that that is the opposite of the situation. And actually, I did original research on the subject, but the grittier individuals were more likely to quit than the ones with less grit. And so, we have to be careful of that mentality, like, oh, we need kids these days aren't tough enough. No, they're like more determined to self-fulfill their needs. And if they view something as not working out, they're just going to go find something else to do.
Well, I will tell you, early in my career, we were looking to merge with a larger organization, and there was a lot of internal angst in the organization. And even as a brand new firefighter, you could feel it. You could feel its impact on what should be the just the most amazing career and the most amazing experience and the best job. And it was like, when it's not good, it's almost like exponentially not good. It's not just, yeah, it's a tough career, it's a tough thing, or it's magnified because it's something so precious that you wanted so badly, and that's like, wow, that's not what I signed up for.
Yeah, and we see that whether it's passion for the career or passion for a job or the mission, the more passionate the individual, they tend to be more susceptible to things like burnout and other negative outcomes anytime something isn't as they expected. In the world of nursing, they call it transition shock. When a nurse goes through school and then gets out into the field and realizes how unpleasant it may be to work in a healthcare setting. And we have to watch ourselves in the fire service of that same phenomenon. Whether it's the I always equate it to like the military commercials, like the Rob Zombie playing in the background. And like, we have to be careful of that because we don't want to oversell, like all we do is rappel out of helicopters and put out fire, because that's certainly not accurate. And in the same light, we also don't want to, we don't want people to come on to the fire service and find it hostile or at least not welcoming, because in the same light, if they're really excited to be there, and we don't make them feel welcome, the reaction could be even stronger for somebody who is really excited to be there.
Yeah, and I think the role the fire service plays in a community, at least my lived experience, the role that the fire service plays in the community and its ability to connect with the community, whether it's on legitimate life-threatening emergency or just holding somebody's hand, those are equally important events in those individuals' lives. They're equally important. And your ability as an individual, if there's something you're passionate about, to connect with that and give that what you think it deserves, that's really important. It's very self-fulfilling. And to have that sort of stripped away because the folks that are around you are sort of downplaying it or rolling their eyes or not wanting to participate in it is it's almost personally painful, because it's like, wait a minute, I thought that was super important. It's like, it's just really interesting how that can impact you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we can view that as a source of moral injury in our organizations. You know, when we let that kind of behavior persist and we bring new folks in that are really excited about the mission, they want to do great work, and they're sort of surrounded by maybe attitudes or whatever the case may be, a belief that that's contrary to what they thought they were signing up for or what they wanted to do here in that organization.
If you're a new fire chief coming into an organization, maybe you've been a fire chief or never been a fire chief, you come into an organization and you realize, whoa, we need to like reset things a little bit. From your professional experience, I mean, obviously that can take some time. How how long does it take to change an organizational culture? I mean, I realize it doesn't have a black and white answer, but I mean, just sort of in your experience, is it something you can have a measurable impact on in a 5 to 7 year career as a fire chief, or is it like, much longer than that?
I think 5 to 7 years is a great time frame to have. I was hoping you weren't going to say 5 to 7 months. But you can certainly, especially as a new leader coming from, if you're coming into an organization, I'd advise people not to you know, go running off and kind of implementing their own agenda right away. But you have to take time to get to know the organization, find out, what those root cause issues are, and then start to show people that you're going to take them seriously. And I think you can definitely have that kind of cultural change impact, over a 3, 4, 5 year period for sure.
And I would imagine you would be an excellent resource for somebody to help them understand that, getting a lay of the land and understanding what you're up against and putting a plan together to address it, is really, really critical. And who you bring into your sphere to sort of help you make sense of that, I think is really critical as well. I would imagine that's a large part of what you do and have done.
Yeah, and that is, it is really for me, as a former firefighter paramedic, and somebody that got too interested in a subject and stayed in school for too long now. I it's super rewarding to me. In fact, I don't know that there's necessarily anything more personally rewarding to me at this point to be able to do that for an organization and to kind of help them understand what their problems actually are instead of getting caught up by those superficial issues, and being able to kind of dig in and lay out a game plan for what the next couple of years need to look like to get to that place, and then see it actually work that way. It is probably the most fulfilling thing professionally for me.
That's awesome.
All right, I think that's a great high note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have a question for the panel, please reach out to us at fireheadlines@wfca.com and let us know what's on your mind. We'll see you back here in the new year for more Fire Headlines.